All right, it's my great pleasure to introduce the last speaker of this little session, Katharina Herfeld at University of Hanover. Is going to be telling us what empirical network analysis can do for integrated HPS in the case of model transfer. So take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. So what I'm going to do in this talk is really to make a fairly general and methodological point that should motivate us to use computational methods, but particularly empirical network analysis in integrated HPS. And the kind of example that I focus on, because I'm personally interested in it and just started a project on it, is the studying of model transfer in science. And in this way, and also in other ways, as you will see, it relates to Maximilian's talk and issues that he discussed earlier, particularly on the methodological challenges of case studies in HPS. So my starting point is really observation that there has been this increasing trend in several branches of philosophy, but also particularly in the history of science, to use computational methods. And the question is whether this trend has any concrete implications for integrated HPS. And what I propose is that it has, particularly for branches, so beyond HPS even, namely branches like philosophy of science and practice, that heavily focus on or heavily draw on case studies to make their, to work out their philosophical accounts or claims or what have you. And why is that? As we all know, of course, the general idea underlying particularly integrated HPS is to link the conceptual level of philosophy of science to the factual level of historical case studies by way of their integration, and thereby ideally, as we have heard already before, ground philosophical claims or accounts or concepts in actual scientific practices. However, as you probably also know, this integration and how it should look like, how it can be achieved, what exactly it amounts to, what kind of criteria, success criteria are there to evaluate it. This kind of integration has long been debated in integrated HPS, and one major problem in settling this debate concerns particularly the role of case studies and the underlying methodology, I think, prescribing how to use them and what we can learn from them in integrated HPS. So what's the role of case studies in integrated HPS? Roughly, they fulfill, if you look at the literature, at least 3 core functions. That's not a non-exhaustive list, of course. First, they can help us to generate philosophical accounts, concepts, theories, claims. And here the idea is really to take the actual science as a source of inspiration instead of just starting from the armchair to think about science, as has been done for quite a long time, and thereby make sure that the philosophical accounts that we come up with actually capture what's going on in science. Second, if we already have a philosophical concept or a theory or account, case studies can allow for their conceptual refinement. And this works in that they function as some kind of test bed for those philosophical accounts or concepts or claims. So they, by showing us when and where actual scientific practices might deviate from our generalizations, case studies can then allow us to modify those generalizations, rethink them, or even, throw them away if we want. And third, case studies are often meant to empirically justify philosophical concepts or accounts or claims or what have you. Once I apply my generalization to a case and thereby show that it describes this case particularly well, then I could take my generalization to be empirically justified. And those are the 3 kinds of ways in which philosophers have justified the use, in general, justified the use of case studies. So, of course, it has also been recognized in the literature that case studies face a number of challenges. Maximilian has already highlighted or hinted at that. And those challenges target the way in which they fulfill those functions. And this in turn hampers the integration that I've mentioned before between philosophy and history. And the major, way in which these challenges have been captured has been, I think, done by Pitt in 2001, by formulating what he called the dilemma of case studies. And the general idea of this dilemma is that the case study is by itself particular. It's an individual instance of a scientific practice or an epistemic object or what have you. However, philosophers, of course, want to generalize from those cases, and those generalizations should potentially be robust across many cases to ensure that they are just, sound and justified. And particularly, this dilemma can be stated as follows. This is how Pitt has specified or formulated it further. Is the first horn of the dilemma says that if we want to start top down from a general philosophical account or concept, and then look for a case to exemplify or justify it, we might, of course, fall prey to selection bias, or as it has been called, cherry picking here. That is, we choose a case that best fits our account and ignore those cases that would have eventually questioned our account. But the problem, Pitt argues, is not solved when we just stick closer to the facts, so to say, and that's the second horn of the dilemma. Namely, if we start bottom up, so to study very closely the concrete case, it's still unclear what exactly burns our generalizations that we draw from them. And even if we study many different cases, or a few, we can only study so many, but if we study a few cases, this might not be representative, and given the problem of induction and problems of underdetermination, we are not justified in making these inferences. So there's clearly a problem in using case studies according to Pitt. And to address that, I think we need to rethink the relationship between the level of cases and philosophy, or to put it more generally, between the history and philosophy. So Ha-Seok Chang has responded to this dilemma, and he argues that the dilemma only emerges because we think of this relationship between philosophy and cases in terms of what he calls the traditional model that you see here on the slide, on the left-hand side of the slide, which presupposes some kind of top-down, bottom-up relationship between the general level of philosophy and the particular level of historical cases that are supposed to confirm those philosophical claims or accounts or what have you. And Chang argues that that's the wrong way or wrong model to think about this relationship, and proposes the cyclical model that you see here on the right-hand side, that he thinks is an alternative. And on this model, the relationship between case studies and philosophical concepts and claims has to be viewed as a continuous iterative process between abstract concepts and concrete episodes that instantiate those concepts. So on this model, we do not confirm philosophical concepts or accounts, or we don't take cases to represent, but we articulate and constantly refine them in light of new cases. And according to Chang, this relationship is not a relation between the general and the particular, but one between the abstract and the concrete, which basically means that the concrete instantiates the abstract. And this can be done in different ways. So cases can differ, which is different from taking this relationship to be one between the particular that is a direct representation of the general. And I very much like this proposal by Chang, but I think one open question for the cyclical model is how this iterative process can be actually followed systematically to ensure comparability between and some degree of generalizability from cases, because that's what we ultimately also need on his account. And I think that combining traditional philosophical methods such as conceptual analysis and the case study methodology that we already know from integrated HPS with computational methods can actually ensure the systematicity. Now, I propose that empirical network analysis is such a tool, and that could already take on this complementary role. And what is empirical network analysis? It's a method that has so far very rarely been used in philosophy, but has been very widely used in sociology of science, so to study science, that's not new, and increasingly also in the history of science. And roughly, it's a broad set of theoretical and computational and statistical tools that is used in a variety of disciplines beyond even sociology to primarily study relational structures between entities. And it thereby can also draw on empirical data when representing those entities and the observed relations between them, and thereby allows to systematically study and analyze the properties of both the entities and the relations between those entities. So generally put, a network consists of two basic things. First, it consists of entities. And when you study science, this can be actors like scientists, epistemic objects, physical events like workshops or conferences, what have you, institutions, publications, and so forth. And second, it consists of relations among those entities. These can be collegial or co-author relationships, can be acknowledgement relationships, but can also be similarity metrics, such as, for instance, topical overlaps between publications and so forth. And empirical network analysis has been advanced in recent years, of course, because we have better data and we have a huge amount of data, but that data is also much better in quality nowadays. So it lends itself to be used to study science. Now, by asking the question of what empirical network analysis can offer to integrate HPS against this dilemma of case studies that I just sketched, the claim that I would like to defend in the rest of the talk is that empirical network analysis can help case studies to better fulfill these three functions that I've mentioned before by allowing for an iterative navigation through this cyclical process that Chang proposes between the abstract concepts and the concrete episodes in a systematic way, okay? And to understand how to do this, how it can fruitfully complement these traditional methods, let's see how Chang characterizes this process, this iteration in greater detail. He characterizes this process by specifying 4 steps. We can either start, according to Chang, first with a historical episode or a philosophical framework. That's also what we oftentimes do in HPS. And here, in this particular case, now I start from a philosophical framework that can exist or that we can come up with, says Chang. And first, we would check whether this framework fits a specific episode. And when we see that the framework does not help us to understand the case that we have in mind, we then in a second step revise or this framework, or even might generate a new one that gives a better understanding of this specific episode. And third, if we have a framework that roughly fits our case, we further develop and refine our framework and work it out in greater details. And we do so by applying it very widely to as many episodes as we can and change it in light of studying these episodes. And fourth, if we can successfully apply this framework very widely, we then take it as empirically justified. However, Chang is very clear on saying, well, we don't aspire towards some kind of universality here, and because we will never stop this iterative and dynamic process of articulation of philosophical concepts, just as science also changes all the time. But he leaves the details open of how exactly to do that in a systematic way, such that we can study comparable episodes and that these episodes, or make sure that these episodes also share a set of key features and elements upon which we then can draw to refine those philosophical concepts. So now I would like to go through this 4-step procedure by following a particular example, namely model transfer in science. It's a concrete scientific practice, or it's a concrete scientific case or episode that we want to develop a philosophical account of. So model transfer is a key characteristic, I would say, in modern science. If you take the Lotka-Volterra model, it was used originally to explain predator-prey interactions in population biology, but then got transferred into fields like medicine to study the growth of cancer and economics to study the business cycle. And you find in science many of those kinds of examples where models or parts of the model are transferred across fields. And to study model transfer, Chang proposes now to start with this philosophical framework. And when I started studying model transfer, I found that someone who said something about it in his very early work was Thomas Kuhn. And Kuhn acknowledged that innovative knowledge, and I think we can also include model transfer here, which implies the transfer, of course, of a new model from some source domain into some target domain, is a catalyst for progress in a field. But to be progressive, model transfers need to overcome what Kuhn calls the essential tension. And this model has to be, and he means by that, that on the one hand, a model has to be novel and innovative for the target domain, which happens when it keeps elements from its source domain in which it originates. But then the model that is transferred needs to be adapted to traditional standards and frameworks of the target domain in order to become accepted. So it has to be modified somehow in the transfer process while keeping certain elements from the source domain. So there needs to be a balance between innovative and traditional elements. And the question now, the philosophical question now, when you want to explain model transfer, is how this tension is actually resolved in practice. And what is the philosophical framework that might already exist to think about this question? And so what I did was I looked into what Kuhn had to say about this. And Kuhn sketched very roughly that this essential tension can be overcome by a specific modification procedure that consists of what he called in some early lectures. Of course, later on, he changed his mind when he came up with his paradigm theory, or he changed his view, or further explicated his view, or specified his views further, is what he called translation. And the problem with Kuhn's framework of translation as modification is that what he calls translation is a concept that is really very loosely defined. It's not easily applicable to a concrete episode, and it can very quickly be misinterpreted. So my goal to study model transfer was doing philosophical work a la Chang to get a more precisely applicable and justified philosophical concept of translation, and then capture part of this modification process that helps me to explain model transfer. And I did so by starting with traditional case study methodology and then complemented with empirical network analysis. Now, the next step is then that according to Chang, that we take a historiographical puzzle and see whether this loose philosophical framework fits a concrete episode. And in our case, that was the spread of rational choice models across the social and behavioral sciences. And I approached this historical episode with the philosophical concept of translation in mind and see whether it fits to partly explain this transfer of rational choice models. What I mean by rational choice models is basically models that are grounded in either expected utility theory or game theory. And as such, they originate in John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern's theory of games and economic behavior. And this is actually a historical episode that is quite well known and has been studied quite a bit by historians of science. And so it was interesting in that sense that we know already a lot of history about it, but we have already quite a lot of history about it, or historical accounts about it, about this case. So now we started to study this particular historical episode in detail. And first, what I saw from existing historical account was where those rational choice models were transferred into. And this was a wide range of domains. On the slide, you see how the outcome of this diffusion process or transfer process looked like in the 1970s. And all those different fields, be it psychology, welfare economics, mathematical economics, statistics, organizational theory, finance, and so forth, those models spread in all of those domains. So how did those models get there, and could we think of this process as one of translation, was the question that I posed to the literature, so to say. So to answer those questions, I studied further the details of this episode. And if you have more questions about this, we can talk about this later. So I studied the social, political, institutional context of those models and the transfer process. the relevant contributions, adopting them, the key actors, authors making those contributions, and so forth. And I could make some ad hoc observations about the actors and scientific contributions that actually adopted these kinds of models, and thereby enabling this transfer process. And what you see here is indeed, when you studied the historical literature, you saw that there were specific contributions that seemed to play a kind of translating role, in that when you looked at them, you saw that the authors of these books and papers really modified in different ways the kind of rational choice models that they were adopting. So this kind of modification could be thought of as translation in the first instance. So usually you would, of course, go into greater detail, but you would, as an HPS scholar, you might want to stop here. You would only identify and describe the roles of those contributions anecdotally, and then thereby say that they come close to what Kuhn's translation amounts to. And that's what I also initially did. But you would probably study those scientific contributions also in greater detail and check out what they did and so forth. However, that we would not really be able to know whether we identified, all the domains in which rational choice models got transferred, whether the kinds of contributions that we identified were who undertook this modification and also linked the domain of origin, namely mathematics, to their particular discipline, whether we identified all of them, and so forth. And we would not easily be able to compare all these different contributions with each other. And I think this is, however, required if we want to generalize from this particular case of rational choice model transfer to a more general and abstract concept of the translator a la Kuhn. So what can we do with empirical network analysis here? Without going into the details, what does empirical network analysis do in order to help us connect the concrete episodes and the abstract concept? In a paper with my colleagues, what we did, very roughly, we can also talk about the details in the Q&A. What we did was then complement all this analysis, this historical analysis, with a co-citation analysis to study the spread of rational choice models. And first, we constructed a network topology consisting of all the relevant scientific contributions made in the form of papers and books that adopted rational choice models between the date of the publication of the Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern in 1970 to trace this transfer process. Second, we took this topology to represent the outcome of the diffusion process in form of different clusters, as you can see here also on the slide, that represented the contributions from different fields. Each color represents a different discipline into which these rational choice models spread. And by using clustering algorithms, we identified clusters of publications belonging to the same field. Say, if we saw before, whether they belong to mathematical psychology, mathematical finance, game theory, and so forth. Third, by using other algorithmic procedures, we systematically classified different kinds of contributions in those fields on the basis of features they actually shared with respect to their network position and their network properties. And finally, on the basis of their shared network position and properties, we could then define the roles of those key contributions in the transfer process systematically and apply the same procedure to a different episode. We haven't done so, but we hopefully will do so very soon, which makes those episodes then comparable in relevant respects. And this, of course, brings or brought a high degree of systematicity in that we used rule-based procedures and plausible clustering algorithms and measures to define and analyze the role of different scientific contributions in this particular episode. So the result of this analysis was then that we saw a large overlap in terms of the scientific contributions that we identified as having this kind of translating role in our historical counts, and on the basis of the network analysis, also in terms of the different disciplines into which these models were transferred. But there were also certain deviations, and which were interesting surprises for us, which were also shown by the analysis. So from that analysis, we could then go back to the apps. So we did this network analysis on the basis, of course, on our concrete episode. So from that analysis, then we went back to the abstract level of the philosophical concept of translation and could come up with a role typology to classify different publications or scientific contributions that play different roles in the transfer process. So we could identify not only a translating role, but also a elaborator role and a specialist role. And on the basis of our historical study, we could verbally describe them, these 4 roles that scientific contributions can play in enabling this transfer. But more importantly, we could also define them in terms of their network positions and properties, as you see here in the second and third row. So we characterize them in terms of structural properties, such as that they were located, where they were located in the topology, and the properties of their connectedness and so forth. And so as you can see here, we got not only a more detailed verbal description of the translation publication as having some kind of brokerage position between the source domain and the target domain, but we also have technical transferable criteria, for example, the highest connectedness between clusters representing different disciplines and within the network of early adopters, to identify them in the network. And then we could further specify and characterize this role in terms of these properties in the network. So in the first step, and we have a long way to go, of course, empirical network analysis allowed us to define an abstract translator concept in terms of general structural characteristics that is, however, informed by a concrete episode. So I'm almost done. How does an empirical network analysis now enable a cyclical yet systematic iteration between the concrete and the abstract level that Chang's model presupposes? So we see that when we think back into how it helps us to fulfill the 3 functions of case studies. So we started with a philosophical concept. It was very vague by Kuhn, left room for misinterpretation and so forth. And however, when we apply empirical network analysis, it helps us that an episode can actually better fulfill these 4 functions in order to further explicate this concept. First, how does it do so? How does it help us to generate a philosophical concept while developing certain rule-based procedures for data collection, for instance, and analysis, and then applying it to a concrete episode of model transfer that interests us? First, avoids, of course, selection bias when reapplied, but also allows for results that provide grounds for a definition of an abstract translator concept in terms of structural characteristics, as I showed before, which are more importantly shared across cases and are identified in our analysis on the ground of a concrete case. Second, how does it help us to refine the translator concept? Well, by allowing for its repeated reapplication to other historical episodes according to the same technical criteria, and of course via predefined and rule-based procedures of data collection analysis, it enables us to a continuous refinement of the concept in light of many different episodes, many more than we can actually study if we only study historical case studies without it. And third, how does it help us to empirically justify the translator concept? An iterative reapplication of the same computational procedure to more episodes than would be feasible without it will certainly produce more robust and comparable results, and eventually lead to further empirical justification to the concept of translator that we can come up with on that basis. So I think I'm completely over time. I'm sorry about that. I will just leave the last slide like that because it, summarizes a little bit more generally in which way empirical network analysis helps us to helps case studies to fulfill these three functions. And thank you for listening.